Winter is coming. That's the saying, right? I don't know, it's January. Winter's here. I'm confused. I'm new here, could you tell? I am going to attempt to tackle A Game of Thrones, which is book 1 in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. Of course you know what this is, everyone does. I'm the only one who's been living under a rock and didn't watch the show. It was a little bit too violent for me, so I am really nervous going into this book because I bet you it will be the same. But I think it's a little bit better reading it because I can tone it down in my imagination, I can skim past it a little bit. Once they beheaded a horse in the show, I was done. So that's why I'm a little bit nervous for this read. But I do want to try it out. I want to commit to at least book 1. I'm not going to commit to the whole series, but I do want to read this and see what I think of the book. I have picked out my tabs for annotating. I think it will go very well with this edition of the book. And I don't know which colors I'm going to use yet from this, but I do know the topics that I'm going to tab. First of all, I want to tab when a new character is introduced so I can keep track of everybody. Next, I'm going to tab when someone dies, for no real purpose other than it sounds like fun and I bet you there will be a lot of it. Next, I'm going to tag quotes and moments that I like. I did some research on what I can expect as far as themes when it comes to A Game of Thrones. So I think the first theme that I'm going to be on the lookout for and annotate is moments of corruption and ambiguous morality. The other theme I'm going to be on the lookout for is duty versus love. That's enough chit chat, time to get started. I just finished the prologue and my first impressions are that Georgie, I think he'd be okay with me calling him Georgie, we're gonna be spending a lot of time together, really likes his similes. And yes, similes is the correct term because I looked it up before filming this to be sure that I had it correct. On page 8, fear filled his gut like a meal he could not digest. Page 9, the patterns ran like moonlight on water with every step it took. And when the blades met, there was no ring of metal on metal, only a high, thin sound at the edge of hearing, like an animal screaming in pain. Finally, on page 10, his voice was like the cracking of ice on a winter lake. So it's neither good nor bad. I don't know if I really care. It's just something that I definitely noticed as a favorite of Mr. Georgie. I didn't annotate anything in the prologue yet because I'm not sure if we're just setting the stage or if anything is really relevant yet. I'm not sure if these characters matter. But something that I was thinking about is that if you have watched the show but you are reading the book for the first time, it might be kind of cool to also annotate moments of foreshadowing, things that are mentioned that are important later in the book or in the overall series. I thought that would be kind of cool. I have no frame of reference, so I can't do that. I am roughly 20% of the way into Game of Thrones, and wow, there are a lot of POVs, and that's something I normally find very chaotic, and it results in me having a hard time connecting with the characters, but I am finding they are each very distinct, and so I am able to connect with them and get a really good feel for who they are. We have points of view from Jon Snow, Ned, Catelyn, Sansa, Arya, Tyrion, Daenerys. There are so many different characters that I'm learning about. I almost forgot to mention, my favorite POV to read from so far is probably Tyrion, the dwarf. I am enjoying him because he is very insightful, logical, and blunt. He just tells it like it is, and he's pretty right. So I like him, and he has some good words of wisdom. I've been tabbing some of his lines because I like some different things that he has said. So far he's my favorite POV, although favorite character-wise, I don't know if I have a favorite character yet, but I know as soon as I find a favorite character, they'll probably die, because as I understand it, lots of people die in this book, in this series, so I don't want to get too attached. And it's interesting because there are some similarities between some of them. For example, Jon, Arya, and Tyrion seem to be outcasts. They are outcasts for different reasons, either being a dwarf, being the bastard son, or being female. So they all experience this in different ways and kind of have that in common. I like the different contrasting elements that are being established so far. So first of all, when you're in Daenerys's chapters and her points of view. It's interesting the perspective on the political events that have happened, because depending on if you're with her or if you're with the other characters, each one sees the other as the bad guy. So that's kind of interesting to get that perspective. And then even between individual characters, you see contrast. So with Robert the King, who is very much someone who gives into temptation, not really the highest morality. And then on contrast, you have Ned. And even though Robert and Ned grew up together, they have a very different set of morals. And it's not surprising that two sisters have very little in common. Oftentimes we see sisters contrast each other, but between Sansa and Arya, one really cares about formalities and titles and the opinions of others, and the other one is very much a tomboy, doesn't care what anyone thinks, just wants to do what she enjoys and wants to kind of go against the grain and be her own person. So I think that's very interesting, all the different contrasting elements. From the prologue of this book, we know that some supernatural evil is lurking in the background. So that puts an interesting perspective on all the political games that are unraveling right now, because it's like, how important is this really if there's some kind of zombie creature lurking in the background? So that is kind of cool. I'm feeling a little bit, I'm not going to say anxious about that, but it is in the forefront of my mind, wondering when that's going to pop back up. In the first 20% of the book, I have encountered the first animal death. I have mentioned in other videos on my channel that animal suffering and deaths is pretty much the only trigger that I have. I'm very sensitive to that. So I am very much aware that I'm going to be triggered in this book and in this series. So I think what I might do is at the end of this video, I will have a more spoilery discussion about the animal deaths or abuse that occur, so that you know if you're sensitive to that as well. Time to continue on. If you're like me and you get super overwhelmed when there's a whole bunch of characters to remember, then you should know that in the back of the book there's an appendix, and this is the mass market paperback, but I'm sure it's similar with a lot of different editions. But in the appendix, it lists the different houses, which are like the different families, and then the people within that house in like a very short description, and it doesn't seem to be too spoilery yet. So House Stark, I know those characters so far, so this lists out their relationships and the different character names. So this is really helpful, and this is one reason why I didn't annotate like the structure of the characters, because it's listed out for me already. I'm just listing when these characters are introduced to the story.
Does anyone else get super excited when the name of the book is mentioned in the text, or is that just me? Also, I am yelling at a certain character for making a really dumb mistake. It is not going to end up well for them, I can just tell.
I am about 60% of the way into Game of Thrones, so I thought I would do a midpoint check-in, and then I am hoping that I can finish it today because I have the day off, so why not? But that's a little bit ambitious. Page 315, or about 40% of the way into the book, is where I stopped watching the show. So I've already gotten a lot further than that. My initial impression so far are that I'm really confused that there's no magic. So I'm not sure why this is categorized as an epic fantasy. And Georgie also really set my expectations with the prologue, with these creatures that were kind of zombie-like. So I was expecting a little bit of magic, but I haven't seen it yet. It's all been a lot of political maneuvering. As far as the characters go, the kids are just a bunch of assholes, aren't they? pretty much everyone under the age of 13 is just a complete jerk. We have Prince Joffrey, who is 12, I believe. He's the worst of the worst. And then you have Robert Arryn, who is 6 years old, and wow, he needs some help. And even Sansa and Arya, even though I love the Starks, they are kind of brats in their own rights too, so I hate all the children. In Jon Snow's chapters, we were introduced to the character Sam, who is gentle and sweet, and I don't think he's gonna make it just because he is such a fluffy marshmallow, so that's a little bit disappointing. And Tyrion Lannister remains my favorite POV to read from. I think he might be my favorite character so far because he is so cunning. The only other character that's giving him a run for his money for my favorite character is Miss Daenerys, or the Khaleesi. She had a major turn. I am loving seeing her evolution. She is turning out to be very strategic, intelligent, socially aware, and I'm enjoying her journey because I think she's going to be a force to be reckoned with. And that has nothing to do with the fact that I remember the actress from the show and like all the memes and scenes and highlights and everything. I might have been spoiled a little bit for that, but she is definitely one that I like reading about. And in Ned's chapters, while I enjoy his wisdom and his kindness, and I know he's supposed to be the moral compass out of the group, I don't really enjoy him because he's not very strategic. And I wish that he were, because I would love to see a representation of strength in kindness, but I don't think that's the theme of this entire franchise, so I can't really expect that. He is really frustrating me though because he is trusting all the wrong people. He is being a little bit too forthright and honest when I don't think he should be. And he seems to just believe in the best in everybody and not really looking at the reality of the situation. So I am pretty confident he's not going to be with us that much longer. With 40% left in the book, I would say at this point that I am enjoying it, but it is not meeting my expectations. And that's simply because there's no magic or fantasy like I was expecting. It's all political maneuvering, which I did expect a little bit. I just didn't know that would be 100% of it. I am enjoying that element a lot more though. I never thought I enjoyed that in books, but I do like the intelligence of it, so I think I am enjoying that. I'm looking forward to what happens in the rest of this book because I'm pretty sure it's about to get pretty intense. I finished A Game of Thrones and I've had a couple days to sit with it, so now I can definitely give you a full review of my thoughts. I'm going to divide up this review and discuss my thoughts in terms of themes, characters, plot, tone or mood, and finally my thoughts on the animal stuff, which will be pretty spoilery. Starting out with the theme, I mentioned something that I was annotating were instances of corruption or ambiguous morality. And this is something that is very much in the forefront with A Game of Thrones, and I'm pretty sure the entire series as well, because there's a lot of political maneuvering. Everyone is making power plays, trying to get as much power as possible, lots of backstabbing. So that's kind of a given, and you could probably tab that on every page if you wanted to. I also mentioned the theme of duty versus love, love versus duty, whichever order you want to say it. And this was something that was very interesting to watch our characters go through. I think Jon Snow really exemplified this theme, as did Catelyn and Ned. Ned, for example, kind of did a 180. He was very much focused on duty and responsibilities, and towards the end he kind of drastically switched, which I was kind of happy to see because I don't think it should always be an extreme. I also uncovered a much more subtle theme of truth and telling the truth, finding the truth, with the symbolism of eyes and sight in relation to the truth, seeing the truth, for example. Tyrion Lannister is a great example of this. He is described as having mismatched eyes, and yet he is very insightful. And there was actually a quote from him that I tabbed. It said, "Most men would rather deny a hard truth than face it." So he often had truths and insight in relation to eyes, so that's one example. And another very blatant example of this theme and symbolism was with Arya. So she is training to fight and how to use a sword, and her mentor is telling her to always see things, always look at things. And what he's talking about is to look beyond the surface at the truth behind it. So she starts doing that, to not believe necessarily what she's told, take it for face value. She is trying to see beyond that at what's really going on. Now for my thoughts on the characters. I mentioned the abundance of POVs in this book, and I also mentioned how some of those characters were categorized as outsiders, and that's something that they had in common. And I think I would also add to that list Bran and Ned when he joined court and he realized it was a little bit different than he expected. I think he found himself as an outsider as well. Tyrion Lannister remained my favorite POV to read from because of his insight and his capacity for both good and evil. I can't necessarily say he's a good guy or a bad guy. He kind of looks out for himself, but he remained very strategic and witty. He had funny one-liners. He was always kind of talking back to people, so I really enjoyed his POV. However, it is my girl Daenerys who takes the title as my favorite character in this book because her story was so captivating, and she really balanced strategy, intelligence, strength with some moments of kindness, particularly when it came to other women and helping to save other women. So she didn't stop all the evils that were going on around her by my standards, but she did have elements of kindness, so that was great to see. But her storyline was incredible, and her journey, her transformation was awesome. The last chapter of the book is from Daenerys' point of view, and that chapter in itself solidifies the fact that I want to read book 2. Now for my thoughts on the plot. Now, I really went into this expecting an epic fantasy or fantasy horror, and even the prologue really supported that, as I mentioned. I don't really know what that means exactly, but I went into this book expecting creatures, dragons, magic, and spells, and while I got that in the prologue, it didn't come up again until like well after the 70% mark. So I found myself very frustrated with this because it wasn't what I was expecting. I think this book is much better classified as medieval fiction. I mentioned that there is a lot of political maneuvering and backstabbing, a lot of power plays. There are a lot of battle scenes and fighting scenes, yada yada. That was okay, but I did find myself a little bit bored, and that can absolutely be attributed to the fact that I did not have the proper expectations going into this book. But I also found the plot to be incredibly predictable. There was not a single thing in it that surprised me. And again, I have watched the show up to about, what did I say, 40% in this book. So a lot of this is the first time exposure for me. So I can honestly say I wasn't that engaged in the plot. I didn't find it that riveting. It was very predictable. But I am going to give it the benefit of the doubt here. I think that this book is book 1 in a series, and this is probably intended to be a foundation setting book. So maybe the point of this is not to give you plot twists and the unpredictable. Maybe it's just supposed to set up the world and the conflict for you. So I'll let it slide for the plot. Finally, in terms of the tone or the mood of the book, I would definitely say that it's dark and definitely tense. I'd say it's pretty foreboding too. And again, since I think this is intended to be more of an introduction to the overall series, I cannot say that the book itself and the ending was very satisfying. Now let's talk about the animal stuff, and this will probably be a lot more spoilery because I'm gonna speak about specifics in the plot and mention characters and things that happen. So warning, right now this might be a little bit more spoilery than I have done so far in this video. Be forewarned. But I did mention earlier that animal cruelty, animal death, animal suffering, animal violence is a huge trigger for me, and it's the reason that I stopped watching the show, because I didn't like seeing it. When they decapitated a horse in the tournament, that is where I stopped because it just sickened me. I mentioned that I thought reading it could be a little bit better because I could skim past it or I could dull it down in my imagination. So that's why I gave this a shot. And I will say that in terms of the writing, overall, the scenes that could have been really disturbing if I would have watched them with my own eyes were not as detailed as they could have been. So it wasn't that bad, and a lot of things happened off page. So that's why I'd say that it was a little less detailed. For example, on page 159 in this book, Lady the Direwolf dies. And that is the one that I'm talking about. Kind of happened off page because the queen ordered it to be done. Ned said that he would do it. He went to go do it, you know, greeted the dog, but it wasn't something that was like really detailed or anything. So that was really good. And then the purpose of that, I understood. I mentioned how one of the themes in the book was truth. And so going along with that, the death of Lady was almost a symbol for the lie that Sansa told with selfish intentions. So there's a section where Arya and Ned are talking about honorable lies, and what Sansa did was not an honorable lie. So she was the one who was punished with her dire wolf being killed. So the symbolism of that was impactful to me. It wasn't like a needless death or something done for shock value. I also think that moment shows a lot of Sansa's character and how she was still so attracted to Joffrey and so in love with him after he caused her direwolf to be killed. She sees it as like the queen's order and not because of him. And I'm like, wow, girl, you've got some blinders on. You are a damn fool. Speaking of the girls and their direwolves, I think I remember in the show Arya ditching her direwolf in the woods in order to save it because she knew the queen wanted it killed. So she ditches it in the woods so it would go run free and be saved. And I feel like I remember that scene in the show and remember it being like really sad that she's trying to like chase her away. And they did mention that in the book. She was like reminiscing on it. So it was like something she was telling her dad about, I think. And so it wasn't happening live. And it was kind of sad, but only because I was picturing that from the show. So that kind of pulled at my heartstrings just a little bit, but not bad. Basically, everything with the direwolves has been okay so far. So that wasn't as bad as I was expecting. Where I had a tough time was really where we talked about the horses and what the horses went through. So pretty much in any battle scene, the way that these people fight is to attack the mounts of their enemies, which are the horses, right? And so where I had difficulties is the several times where it talked about horses screaming, and that painted a really horrible picture for me. There was some graphic depictions of the violence to the horses that happened during battle. So those elements were rough, and I don't even have a page number marked for that because it happened so many times. There's so many battle scenes where they're fighting each other and they're attacking each other's horses. Definitely the most difficult and graphic scene that I read when it came to animals was in Daenerys's chapter when she was told she had to make a sacrifice to save her husband. So if you're reading this for the first time, if you're worried about animal stuff and you see that coming up, just skip past it because they sacrifice a horse and it is very graphic, very disturbing. I had to skim past that, but I read enough that I was like, okay, this is too much. This is too much. But I also don't think that one is pointless either. I think that one had a very clear intent to show that she was giving a sacrifice. She was under the impression this was the sacrifice that was needed. Doesn't necessarily turn out that way. So I won't spoil that for you. but it's not like a pointless thing that happens. I think it needs to be graphic to show like how committed Daenerys is to saving her husband, and things don't go as she had hoped. See, so it's not that bad. If I can do it, you can do it. And I'm not vouching for the rest of the series because I'm pretty sure not all of the dire wolves make it, but that's at least my experience for book 1, and you can go into it prepared. Those are my thoughts on A Game of Thrones, book 1 in A Song of Ice and Fire. I think that even though I feel kind of so-so about it, as I just went through, I will continue on with the series. I will at least give book 2 a try. I suspect that there will be a little bit more magic, a little bit more fantasy in it, based on how this one ended. I'm told though that it's like book 3 where most of the magic happens, but maybe I'll enjoy it more because now I have the right expectations. It wasn't bad by any means. I enjoyed a lot of the maneuvering, the political maneuvering, so I guess I can expect that in book 2. But I'd have to say this is probably the book that I feel the most accomplished for reading. I was always very intimidated by it, firstly because it's categorized as epic fantasy, which I'm still very, very new to, and also the violence of it, the fact that I DNFed the show. So this is a huge accomplishment. I really enjoyed annotating it. I think I chose my categories very well for the themes and all the different things that I tagged. So very, very positive experience, and I'll see how it goes continuing on in the series. Thank you so much for hanging out with me in this video. I will see you in the next one.